Welcome to the Tales from the Economicon. I am your host, the Economancer, a high priest of the Economicon. Today, we're going to be going back once again to the very dark arts of corruption, and we're going to see the interaction between corruption and economic growth. Is it beneficial? I'm going to make an argument why. Stay tuned. Before I go very deep into this, I want you to go down in the comments and tell me below what you think my argument is going to be. Am I going to come to the conclusion that economic growth needs corruption, or is there some other instances where it may be beneficial? You'll find out. Now, with this, I want to preface this by what is grease the wheel. So, grease the wheel is the proposition that corruption may be beneficial to an economy as a means around red tape or an ineffective government. So, with that definition, let's move into some of the first thoughts into it. So, we're going to take Machiavelli's criticism of democracy and republicanism because it kind of lays the roots in grease the wheel hypothesis. So, Machiavelli essentially stated that privatization begets corruption because people vote for their self-interest rather than the common good. Now, another notable political scientist was Robert Dahl from Yale, who actually battled C. Wright Mills, who I've done a video on, who made a very similar claim to mine. And this was prior to reading him, but now that I've read him, his is much better than mine. But the claim was that in America, there are a numerous set of elites, and they're all vying for power through contention and compromise. Now, Dahl had also stated something to the effect that all democratic or competitive politics are corrupt, as they are simply a bribery of the electorate. Now, this is something that I've made as a criticism towards social democrats, something like they're going to incentivize more people to vote for them because they're going to try to give them things. Now, again, this isn't saying that what they're doing is necessarily corruption or wrong, but it is essentially a form of corruption, given this definition by Robert Dahl, and it kind of makes sense. If you're voting for someone, it's probably because they're doing and saying things that you want, so they're going to try to bribe you to vote for them, right? And this is no means a damnation of like a plurocracy, which is pluralistic elitism, right? So I'm not saying that that's bad, but in a game to capture power, you're trying to get votes. And so all of these individuals are competing for votes for their own self-interest, right? So they have to appeal to the largest group possible that maximizes their self-interest as well as the populations. So where does the term grease the wheel come from anyway? Well, there are three major academics that kind of spawned this grease the wheel hypothesis. That's Nathaniel Leff, Samuel Huntington, and Colin Lays. Each of them come from a different school of thought. Leff was a student of Hirschman, and both of them were mostly dubious of like this paradigmatic approach on I am X or I am Y. But essentially, he could be given the treatment as an institutionalist or a neo-institutionalist. I'm sure he's rolling over in his grave on that one. Then we have Huntington. So he's a modern liberal, but he really contradicted himself because in the beginning he was really neoliberal, laid some of the strongest foundations for neoliberalism. Later in his life, he moved to this neo-realistic, neoconservative kind of leanings. And I implore people to read him and Fukuyama, who is actually his student. They're two of the most cited political scientists that you'll find, especially when it comes to international relations. And then we have Colin Lays. He was mostly a classical Marxist, but you could probably label him now as a neo-Marxist. He was heavily influenced by post-colonialism. So what does this tell us about, these arguments being made? They come from different academic strains. Well, it tells you that there's a powerful argument to be made because all of these are made about developing countries, and that corruption is beneficial due to the poor governance structure. So, how does some of these theories work? So, Left had contributed to the theory that bribery, or at least forms of corruption, helped and promoted entrepreneurship. So Huntington perceived stultifying, over-centralized bureaucracy stunted economic growth, but by nature of people being dishonest, there were some dynamic changes happening in an economy because of corruption, right? And Lays laid the foundation for this moralizing critique, which is something you've heard me say prior, which presented corruption as a discourse between the West positionality of corruption and normal tribal practices and national interests. So Lays also lays down this idea that corruption could help allocate better public officials because it increased the incentives for them to go into government rather than private, especially in developing nations that have low pay to public officials. In my opinion, I lean more heavily with Left on a lot of his arguments. He is a much less known scholar, especially when we compare him to, Huntington, who was probably top 5 most cited political scientists. But, you know, his work outside of Susan Rose Ackerman from the anti-corruption side developed the foundation for most of the argumentations in Grease the Will hypothesis. His work in economic development through bureaucratic corruption, it's a short 7-page treatise, and it lays the foundation for almost any argument you could think of for why corruption could benefit a potential developing country, or B, helping a country move from one level stage of development to another. So in the literature, I mean, it's not given as absolute that a developing country will be benefited by corruption, because a lot of the arguments are like, okay, so in the short term, it may be beneficial, but it creates this latent pattern of individuals doing bad things, right? And so we're not sure where in the development cycle that stops, so it's best to just not start with it. And so if you're using corruption to build your economic system is going to continuously be corrupt. But let's just take for a moment for the idea that in the face of bad governance, and we have developing countries, in the short run, it is optimal for corruption to happen, right? Maybe a long-term decline, but in the short run, it's definitely something that's beneficial. But what does that tell us about developed nations? Well, the bulk of literature and economic theory would say absolutely not. However, I'm gonna pose something to you. Let's give corruption a classification within society. Its closest classification is crime. Corruption and crime are a core component of any functioning society, and that the social dysfunction of corruption or crime improves society because it allows for society to see the problem. This identification allows society to punish the bad behaviors, and that leads to this integration and latent pattern maintenance. However, too much will obviously just damage society and destroy it, because, if there isn't this strong shared moral and values in the system, then it's not going to be functional. But corruption in a functional society results in social solidarity and cohesion. A perfect example of this is, the Enron scandal. Everybody stood with social solidarity and cohesion against this level of white-collar crime. So that was beneficial because, one, it opens the eyes into it and it allows these individuals to get punished. And then people can feed back on that and go, well, they got punished for that, so I can't do that. Plus, there's solidarity in the system where everybody's looking at going, yeah, they're bad. And we all come together on that. So that's functional and that's good for society, even if the things that may have happened were bad. Now, one of the better arguments for the functional corruption is lobbying, which many consider corrupt, but it is legal. And this raises the questions on why is it legal in face of corruption we know being so bad and it's immoral, etc. Well, the first reason why is lobbying is transparent. So if you're going to lobby, you have to do all of these sets of tasks that allow you to lobby. So you have to fill out certain levels of paperwork. There has to be a trail of things that are stated. And you kind of have an idea of what this lobbying group's goals are, right? The next is expertise. And this becomes especially important when we move from not me just trying to benefit myself, but doing this common good benefit, right? Especially in a world that's globally connected. We're going to need a lot more information. So think tanks work very closely with a lot of these lobbying groups. That way, these lobbying groups have a vast amount of information to present to policymakers. So even though the thing may be massively beneficial to the lobby group, it's still going to have some spillover effects to other people, right? So this ultimately leads to more information. And then the last thing is that it allows for more opportunity for the population to influence the government. And to think about this, some of the biggest lobbying groups are teachers unions and unions in general, right? So unions in general are very large lobbying groups. So this is a lot of people that are bringing forth arguments for the worker and stuff like that. So that's massively beneficial to the worker. So that allows a large amount of the population to influence the government, all of which makes corruption more in line with that pluralistic elitism argument that I was giving you earlier. And it also kind of lays into the idea of what, Machiavelli said when he was like, privatization begets corruption because people vote for their self-interest rather than the common good. A lot of this is solved by this lobbying, which is a form of corruption, but it solves some of the problems that we had pointed out on the immorality of corruption. So ultimately, this is not a dull argument, and it's not something that can just be dismissed offhandedly as a lot of individuals do. Because at the end of the day, we have things that work as corruption within our society that is good. And then we have the secondary idea is that, one, you can't get rid of, corruption, just like you can't get rid of crime. Because the more money, time, and resources that you spend trying to get rid of crime or corruption, the less that you have to spend on things that might be more beneficial. This is this economic trade-off that we always hear about, economists constantly talking about, that choices or whatever policy is in effect a trade-off. Do you want to make corruption zero, or do you want to have 10% corruption and then have more of these other things, so on and so forth? And it's that key to balancing the cost and benefits that really is why neoclassical economics and economics in general really took over a bulk of the grease the wheel, as well as the sand the wheel hypothesis arguments versus the places where it typically stood in political science and sociology. Because at the end of the day, there is an argument to be made about what's the level of trade-off that you want in your society, in your culture, in your country, in your global sphere. So I want to thank you for taking this walk with me, the Economancer. And I hope that you like, share, comment. Tell me what you think. Tell me if you think my argument's full of crap. Tell me if you think it's persuasive. Have you heard it before? Have you not? Anyway, thank you for taking a walk with me in the Economicon. Have a good day.